The South gets a bad reputation when it comes to racism. And let's be fair, with slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and flying Confederate flags, it will likely forever be linked with its reputation. But that's not to say that the rest of the country is immune from the stain of racism. In fact, some people would say it's worse in other parts of the US. Who could forget the Martha's Vineyard incident? All those progressive Northerners claim that Texas was racist for not wanting illegal immigrants. So Texas sent them to Martha's Vineyard, where they lasted a whole 48 hours before residents showed their true colors and sent them packing. Racism comes in many forms, and this video will show the 8 cities in the West where racism is prevalent. Whether it's racism against Black Americans, white Americans, or anti-Semitism, let's count down the West's worst places for race relations. This list will also look at recent incidents that have gained a certain city its notoriety. While a few anecdotes does not solely make a racist city, it's worth noting that these seemingly one-off incidents inevitably bring out the hidden underbelly of racism within a town. Number 8 is Grants Pass, Oregon. Grants Pass is a town about 4 hours south of Portland, with a population of just under 40,000 people. While Portland gets a lot of attention as being a liberal bastion, it is still the whitest big city in the US. Although Grants Pass may not be a big city, it is following in Portland's footsteps. The racial makeup of the city is 90.9% white. Grants Pass was a former sundown town, meaning Black people were not allowed to be out after dark. It's no surprise that less than 1% of the town is Black. As recently as the early 2020s, protesters of racism have reported being heckled and threatened when marching in Grants Pass. The irony is that Grants Pass was named after Ulysses S. Grant, who fought for the Union during the Civil War. Grants Pass has been in the news, along with much of southern Oregon, as racist, with white supremacist recruitment posters having been found all over town. This, of course, blurs the line of free speech and hate speech that has left the town grappling with its racist legacy and questioning why this town is still a hotspot to promote hatred. Number 7 is Berkeley, California. This one may come as a shock, since Berkeley is the epicenter of the free speech movement. It touts itself as a liberal utopia and promotes its open-minded tolerance. That is, unless of course you're Jewish. After October 7th, anti-Semitic attacks have increased by 360%. Unless you've been living under a rock, you can see that college protests in support of Palestine have turned violent. Jewish students have been attacked and harassed over the past few weeks, and Berkeley is no exception. UC Berkeley is one of 6 universities nationwide facing an anti-Semitism probe from the House Education Committee. It's also under investigation by the U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Arm. Regardless of your political beliefs on the war in Gaza, there is no excuse for targeting Jewish people, particularly Jewish people who have no connection to Israel or its government. Assuming that all Jewish people are to blame is, in and of itself, a form of anti-Semitism. Number 6 is Barrow, now known as Utqiagvik, Alaska. And it's not racism in the traditional sense. Many modern definitions of the word racism have included an element of power, meaning that it's impossible to be racist against white people. But classical definitions, and anyone who thinks judging someone based on their race is wrong, would likely harken back to the basic definition of the word, which is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. Barrow has a history of racism against white people on the part of Native Alaskans. With a town of under 5,000 people, it's small, though it's large by Arctic standards. White people make up only 21.8% of the population, with Alaskan Natives making up 57.2%. There are long-standing tensions, and many Native Alaskans still see the whites as invaders to their indigenous land. While that may have been true many generations ago, those born there today also have called it home for generations. White people have been murdered and harassed, and students at Utqiagvik's middle and high school have reported feeling harassed and unwelcome. Number 5 is Glendale, California. Glendale is a city in the San Fernando Valley in the northern suburbs of Los Angeles. It has a population of 196,000 people, and despite it being a suburb of one of the most diverse cities in the country, white residents make up nearly 63% of the population, with Black residents being only 1.7%. The only minority group that has a substantial percentage are Hispanic and Latino, at a mere 17%. So how does a suburb of LA have such a sordid racial balance? Like many sundown towns, Black people were harassed, intimidated, and murdered, making the thought of moving your family there suicidal. For decades, Glendale was a hub for the American Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan, and the KKK held rallies in Glendale as late as the 1980s. So while many people give the South the side-eye when it comes to racism, California has 2 cities on this list so far and have targeted 2 different groups. According to Tara Peterson, the chief executive officer for the YWCA Glendale and Pasadena, the sundown practice in Glendale lasted until the 1990s. Number 4 is Bellingham, Washington. Bellingham is a picturesque town nestled in the Cascade Mountains, about an hour and a half north of Seattle and just an hour and 20 minutes from Vancouver, Canada. Bellingham has about 92,000 residents, with 75% of them being white and a mere 6% being Asian. Bellingham became notorious for its racism against Asians, going back to the Bellingham riots of 1907. On September 4, 1907, the demands of white workers came to a vicious head, resulting in a riot. White workers broke into lumber mills and pulled South Asians from their work, then entered their bunkhouses, destroying property and stealing valuables. Within days, the Asian community was gone, having been, in the approving words of one local newspaper, wiped off the map. In 2023, 4 teenagers were arrested in Bellingham for alleged hate crimes as they followed a man home from work, whipped him with their t-shirts, and threw rocks at him. What was most shocking was that the teens were only 14, which has the town questioning how kids so young could have learned that hate. It's worth noting that Bellingham was also a sundown town. Number 3 is Honolulu, Hawaii, which is about as far west as we'll get. It's also the only state capital on this list. Hawaii has long been hailed as a racial utopia, where whites are not the majority, despite making up about 75% of the US as a whole. Asians hold the clear majority of the city, but in spite of this, Native Hawaiians still report racism at alarming rates, and in ways that can often be considered invisible. For example, Honolulu has a chronic homeless crisis, and it affects Native Hawaiians at a staggeringly high rate. A disproportionate 28% of the homeless population identified as Native Hawaiian, despite making up only 8% of the city's population. Additionally, Native Hawaiian women and girls experience violence at rates disproportionate to their population size, as more than a quarter of missing girls in Hawaii are Native Hawaiian. Calling the island chain a racial utopia is part of the erasure of Native peoples and their plight for equality. Number 2 is Albuquerque, New Mexico. While New Mexico is often criticized for racism against Native Americans, Albuquerque has faced an alarming amount of Islamophobia. Like anti-Semitism, Islamophobia isn't racism in the sense that it isn't about a person's racial background, but the results are the same for the marginalized group. With Muslims making up only 1% of the city, it's no surprise that fear swept across the Muslim community when it seems there was a serial killer or killers in the area specifically targeting Muslims. In the span of a week in August of 2022, 4 Muslims were brutally murdered. Islamophobic attacks spiked after 9/11 and seem to have hit another uptick since the October 7th terrorist attack against Israel. Many Muslims in Albuquerque have reported feeling unsafe, particularly while the killer remained at large. Muslim businesses closed their doors, people stayed inside, and women wouldn't venture out alone. The twist in this case is that when the killer was caught, he himself turned out to be Muslim. One would think that this is case closed, and no Islamophobia was actually lurking in the city. But this revelation exacerbated the scenario, as many of the city's residents lashed out by claiming that Muslims are all violent. One Muslim resident said, "It's sad they would label 25% of the world's population as all violent, just because of the cowardly acts of one man." Muslim residents in Albuquerque faced a mixed bag of tricks. On the one hand, they weren't being hunted down on the basis of being Muslim. However, the revelation that the killer was Muslim exacerbated racial tensions between Muslims and their non-Muslim neighbors. Muslim residents now find themselves having to justify the murders as personal feuds, rather than something inherently violent embedded in their community. As one resident said, when there is a white serial killer or a white person in Albuquerque commits a murder, no one blames all white people and accuse white people of being violent. But when it's a Muslim, they blame our entire community. And number 1 is Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Coeur d'Alene is a city 7 hours north of Boise and just 40 minutes east of Spokane, Washington. The population is just under 57,000 residents, with 98.3% of the population being white. Native Americans are the only minority group making up over 1% of the population, coming in at a mere 1.2%. You may wonder how a city with virtually no black people could even have instances of racism. Let's start with why it's so white to begin with. In the early 1970s, Richard Butler established an Aryan Nation's headquarters in rural Kootenai County on a 20-acre site just north of Coeur d'Alene. The group led parades that enticed large groups of young people in downtown Coeur d'Alene. As recently as the mid-1990s, the Aryan Nations began running its own website, one of the first websites specifically dedicated to recruiting white supremacists. Coeur d'Alene seemed to be following a path similar to Leith, North Dakota. See our video on the 10 most racist towns in America for more information on Leith and its bizarre climb to notoriety. Many of Coeur d'Alene's residents have fought back against this group and have even led violent clashes. And while this may seem like progress, Coeur d'Alene made headlines in March of 2024 when a Utah basketball team experienced harassment and racial slurs while in the northern Idaho town for an NCAA tournament. According to police reports, as the team walked from the hotel to a restaurant downtown, they were followed by a driver who was shouting racial slurs at them. When they left dinner to return to their hotel, the driver and others who were recruited to harass the team followed them back to the hotel, revving their truck's engines and harassing them further. This proved that Coeur d'Alene's legacy of racism, while on the decline since the 1990s, is still lurking beneath the surface.